questions as we go through, you can add those to the chat, and then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end of the meeting to answer questions and anything else you want to talk about. But yeah, so we're here for Elevation Certificate Section B, and also a couple of other sections that will be included in this, E, G, and F. If you missed yesterday's section on Section A, that has been uploaded to YouTube. So we record all of these sessions and then we put them on our YouTube channel so you can find it there. So yeah, we're going ahead with Section B today. So that's the mapping section. Uh-oh. Okay. So what is the elevation certificate? So this is an official FEMA document that verifies these different elevations for the structural components of a structure that pertains to the compliance for floodplain management. So those are defined in the local ordinance, and they are based on federal, state, and local requirements. So these are only for structures. So I have been asked about elevation certificates for things that are not structures. So we're only talking about residential and non-residential buildings. And so other types of development wouldn't require an elevation certificate, but they would need permitting. So this is a separate document from the permit that is required for new structures. And so it can also be used in support of a letter of map change application. So instead of needing a separate survey, you could use this as documentation that a structure is qualified for a letter of map change, meaning that the lowest adjacent grade is at or above the base flood elevation. And so the base flood elevation is documented in this section, so section B, as well as the mapping information. And so it is required for, again, new structures or something that is substantially improved. So if someone puts on an addition or other improvements that are equal to or greater than 50% of the market value, that's considered a substantial improvement, and you would need to verify that it's in compliance with the current regulations. And so that means that the lowest floor is at least at or above the current base flood elevation. Sorry, the lowest floor is 1 foot above the current base flood elevation. So that's a state higher standard that we have, 1 foot of freeboard. And so that has to be documented with a finished elevation certificate. And so not an under construction, not based on drawings, but the actual finished construction. However, having an elevation certificate that is based on drawings or under construction is a good pre-building document to have, just so that you know the while it's under construction that it is actually being elevated appropriately. And so that would be part of the inspection process, but you can require that developers provide you with an under construction elevation certificate as long as it's followed up with the finished construction certificate. So in Kansas, an elevation certificate can be completed by a surveyor or an engineer. Architects cannot do it. I think they can in other states, just in Kansas, it has to be a surveyor or an engineer. And then technically, the elevation certificate is a form that's not mandated by FEMA, but it is highly recommended. There's just no reason to not use it. It just has all of the information that you would need to verify, and you know, it supports, giving out a certificate of occupancy. So you would withhold that until you get the finished elevation certificate, and that way you know everything is in compliance, and that goes along with the permit. So once an elevation certificate is certified, it doesn't expire. It only can be invalidated by changes to the actual structure. So when someone does put on an addition or something like that, that changes the actual structure, that could invalidate the elevation certificate. But once it's certified on the current form at that point in time, it doesn't expire. So the form will expire. So it expires in June of 2026, I believe. And so after that time, there's a grace period. So we would still use that form until such point that FEMA releases the new elevation certificate, and then we would have to use that. So as long as it was certified on the form that was current at that time, it doesn't expire, unless it gets invalidated by changes to the structure. So who can complete by section? So yesterday we went over section A, and that can be anybody. And the same thing with section B, the firm information, so the flood insurance rate map information can be filled out by anyone. So you don't have to be a licensed surveyor or engineer to fill that part out. And some communities will just preemptively fill that out for a developer or a surveyor or whoever is going to complete the form, just to make sure that that information is correct because mistakes are common as far as the firm information. And it just kind of helps prevent any mistakes. So that is an option, or you might want to provide them with that information, and we'll go through that whole section. Um, it's just, I don't know if it's a best practice, but it's just a recommendation. And then, as I mentioned, we have these other sections. Section E would be building measurements, so a survey is not needed. And then F is the certification, so just whoever is doing those measurements would sign off on it. And then section G is important. This is new to the form, so um, that is something that was added to this version of the form. And so it's for the community official to complete and give additional information about why the form is being filled out and all of that. So we'll go through that, but that is a new addition to this version of the form, and it's recommended. So basically, it needs to be filled out. It's not optional, it's recommended. So in FEMA speak, that means it needs to be done by the community official whenever it's received. And that just kind of helps uh, reinforce floodplain management requirements. So we'll go through that. So the FEMA Map Service Center, or the MSC, this is the official FEMA website where you can find all of the community mapping information. So any community that has a flood insurance rate map can find it here. Um, and so their version of the web map is the National Flood Hazard Layer, or the NFHL. So if you pull up this website, this is the homepage that you find. And so if you have a digital map, and a lot of communities do, we have some communities that are still on paper maps. We are trying to map out the whole state, but we have not completed that yet. We are, in progress with many communities, different counties, and they're all in different stages of the mapping process. But it is a goal to have the entire state mapped out eventually. So if you have a digital firm and you pull up the Map Service Center, you can type in an address there and it should pull up for you um, that address, and it'll have the floodplains mapped there. Like I said, this is their version of the web map. Um, but if you are looking for other products, you can find them under Search All Products, and then that will take you um, to where you want to go. But if you, again, type in an address in the National Flood Hazard Layer and you have a digital map, it should look like this. It'll pull it up for you, and you can see there, that's their version of the floodplain mapping. So I typed in our office address and it pulled it up, and we are adjacent to a floodplain. So you can see there, the floodway is mapped in that cross hatching that's kind of blue and red. And then the AE zone is there, and then the 500-year floodplain, or the shaded zone X there, in orange. And then you can see all of the cross sections and all of that type of information. So if you want to do that, this is a very quick and easy way to do it. It can get busy during the day, so it might crash out. We do have a state version of this, so we'll look at that. But since this is the national uh, flood hazard layer, it can get busy during the day and not work for you. But if you hit dynamic map, it'll make a ferment for you. So that's what we call it. It's just kind of a flood hazard map that is specific to a certain property or a certain area. So that's what I've done here. You can see our office with the red pin there, the date of the firm panel, the full map number there. It says City of Topeka. It shows you the county and city boundaries, and then, of course, all of the floodplain information there to the right of our office. So that's what happens. You can use this. You can download this to a you can download it as a PDF or however you want to do it, and then you can attach this to a permit or whatever property file that you have. So it's a very useful tool. Again, for digital maps, you can just pin it down by address this way. Um, oh, and that's what the full firm looks like, or ferment. So you can see the entire legend there. It's very detailed with all of the different floodplain features there. And then you can use this to verify the map information in section B on the elevation certificate. And then, of course, you can use this to at least spot check the base flood elevation calculation. So you definitely want to check that on an elevation certificate before issuing a permit. You want to make sure it at least makes sense what they've come up with for the base flood elevation, and don't just assume it's correct. And then you would keep this ferment with the permit and other documentation that you receive for development. And so again, that's our office building, and it shows you our zone. So we are in a zone X, which means we're in the minimal risk area. So we're outside of the floodplain, but you can see the adjacent floodplain there, and all of the, again, cross sections and the different zones and everything. So it's very detailed. It's a useful tool. Again, we do have a state version of this, and I think I have some slides on that. Um, so if you go to search all products, this is what you'll come up with. It asks you to select the county and then community. And so you can select any of the cities in that county, or you can select the unincorporated, and there's also an option to select all communities. So just whatever you're looking for. And then based on that, it will pull up your effective products, any pending products, and also your historic products if you need that to verify, something that was developed in the past, you might need your historic products and then the flood risk products. So if you go to effective products, that's everything that's regulatory right now. And so that includes your map panels, it includes your flood insurance study and any letters of map change. It'll show you your letters of revalidation that basically how mapping projects over the years have impacted your letters of map change, when they were invalidated, when they were revalidated. So very useful. And then as long as you know what map panel you're looking for, that's what this lists. So this is all the firm panels for that particular community. In this case, I've pulled up Topeka. I think we're still in Topeka here. So it shows you all of the effective map panels. And so these became effective in 2011. So if you know what panel you're looking for, you can open it up here. There's also the index. So if you see that there, the IND, that first product, that's the index map. And basically it's a map of all the panels. So it shows you where they're located and it gives you some landmarks to decipher where exactly that is. And then it'll help you determine which panel you're looking for. And so this is the old index for the city of Lawrence, but it's just an example of what that looks like. This is an older one. The updated ones are a little bit better than this, but it shows you, the general location of those panels. So here you can see the airport. It shows you the railroad. It gives you some major highways and some other landmarks so that you would know which panel that you're looking for. And then if you open a firm panel in the search all products function, this is what it looks like. So it's a little bit different mapping style than the National Flood Hazard Layer. So here you have the boundaries of the floodplain, but they're all in blue in this case. You do have those um, lines that distinguish the different zones. So if you look closely, you can still see the floodway has cross-hatching, but it's also, the same color as the other zones, but they are distinguished by those break lines, I think they're called. Those lines of distinguishment between the floodway, the AE zone, and the shaded zone X 500-year floodplain. So those are all still there. It's just a bit different. And then, of course, we have the aerial background that's in black and white. Um, so this may or may not be the best representation of the floodplain. Again, you can use the National Flood Hazard Layer if you have that. But if you are still limited to paper maps, you would go here and get it this way if you don't have the digital maps. Again, most communities that need them do have digital maps at this point. But you can create a ferment. So there's a button there that lets you distinguish an area that you'd like to create a ferment of. So they have these little boxes that you can just kind of drag and drop over the area that you're interested in, as well as the firm panel number, the cover page at the bottom right. You can see there they have a drag and drop box for that, as well as the scale and the north arrow that's just above that. So this is what happens next. You create a ferment and then you pick your size. So the default is 8.5 by 11, normal paper size. Then you select your print area. So if you see the green box on the top left, that's the drag and drop box that I mentioned. You just drop it over the area that you're interested in. And then, as I mentioned, the scale and the north arrow and then the title block. So you can see the boxes over those. They're grayed out on this part, but as soon as you hit next, those will light up and you can adjust those as needed. And then it'll let you preview and then save. So we usually just do PDF and you just download it. And then again, that's something that you can keep with a permit file for development that's ongoing. Just so you have that information for the specific property. So again, it has all that same detail. It just looks a little bit different than the National Flood Hazard Layer. And then, as I mentioned, we have a state version of this, so it's just specific to Kansas. Our current effective floodplain viewer, it's our most used web map that we have. And that's the link to it. You can also find that on our website and other places, but basically, this will show you all of our effective maps that we have in Kansas. It's very much like the National Flood Hazard Layer, but we also have additional data that they don't have. So we have approximate base flood elevations for Zone A. We have just other data that the National Flood Hazard Layer is not going to include because that's all regulatory, and we have some other non-regulatory data that just kind of assists with understanding the specifics of our floodplains in Kansas. Um, and so we have that. We have the NG911 address layer in there. We have, multiple layers that you can turn on and off. Um, so there we have like lettered cross sections. We also have the unlettered cross sections. As I said, approximate base flood elevations, streamline, profile, all of that. So just additional information. And then we have everything that they do. Map and panel number, you can get the full number there. Um, the, so everything that I mentioned there. So this is what it looks like in our viewer. So it's the same information, it just is presented a little bit differently. We do also have the 500-year layer as something that you can turn on and off. So if you go to this site, this is what it looks like. So between the Map Service Center, Search All Products, the National Flood Hazard Layer, and this, it's all presented just a little bit differently, but it's the same information. So it's just kind of what optics do you want. So that's where the layers are. And then we also have draw and measure tools in ours. So that's something the National Flood Hazard Layer does not have. And then if you go to print, we come up with our own version of a ferment. It's the same function. So this is what that looks like. Um, so this is one that I created a while back. So that's Shunganunga Creek. And then, of course, all the mapping information underneath and our own scale and that. So this is what our version of a fermat looks like. Any of those are acceptable. It's just, the different formatting here. But we have all the same information, all the cross sections and everything are available. And then we do have, again, the approximate base flood elevations for the Zone A, which is not available through FEMA and their formatting. So this is one that I made a couple years ago for the Zone A, and this will help you, with the calculation of the base flood elevation, or at least spot checking it to make sure that it makes sense and is reasonable. Um, and this is helpful to surveyors and developers and engineers as well as a resource to help them calculate it. So this is from last year. We have made some progress on these, but just in general, these are our watersheds and our project areas and how we break down projects. So we go by watershed and then break that down into county. So I can probably update this at some point. We do have updated maps of this, and those are available online. And you can go and look at the individual projects and the counties that are part of that. But we have ongoing work across the state to update floodplain maps or provide those who have not had floodplain maps with them. We also have statewide base level engineering. So it's a very rough stage, but it's the first stage of getting a floodplain map. And so we're trying to get ordinances through for communities that don't have floodplain maps to be able to adopt their base level engineering as best available data. Those have been in review by FEMA, but they have not been approved yet. And FEMA has been on a bit of a hiatus on what they can and can't do with administrative changes. So we are awaiting feedback on that. And then this is another broken down by county. We do have updated maps on this, but in general, you can see the progress that we've made throughout the state on different maps. And so these are kind of prioritized by need, places where there are considerable flooding issues and areas where there's lots of development or population growth. Those things kind of help us prioritize which areas need new mapping sooner than others. And as I mentioned, we have the statewide BLE initiative, which has been completed. So it's 2D mapping. That's what we've moved to. So old mapping style is 1D. We've moved to 2D, which kind of helps us characterize the floodplains with better data and better modeling techniques. So obviously, as we've gone on through time, mapping techniques have improved, data collection and capabilities have improved. So we've moved to what we call 2D mapping. And so we've evaluated statewide flood risk. And so the base level engineering, as I mentioned, is not regulatory. A regulatory map, and we do countywide mapping. So once we get through a project to a certain point, we break it down by county, and then that county has its own individual mapping project. And the BLE is the first stage. So it's the basic modeling and some other things, but those have to be enhanced and looked at individually. And we have, regulatory meetings that we have to have with communities to review their individual maps. So it gets more and more specialized as we break it down as we go through the project, but the base level engineering is the basic step that we get to. And so, as I mentioned, it's something that we have as best available data for communities that don't have a map, and many of them are not currently scheduled to get a regulatory map. And so we have this available to adopt as best available data. And that way they could join the NFIP and have something to regulate to that isn't, regulatory binding because there's certain NFIP requirements that go with the regulatory part, but as if they have this, they would have something to base their program on as far as permitting and development and things like that. Things that could be at risk for flooding. So again, we do have that ordinance language, but it's still in review. But it was our hope that we would have communities adopt them as data sets for that kind of decision making and community planning and emergency response and things like that. Um, and it can also, communities have maps that date back to the 70s and 80s. Um, BLE is, newer, but it's also more advanced than that type of mapping, so it can complement those effective, really outdated paper maps and give a better um, Zone A profile than it would have, back then. And so it can help provide that additional coverage where streams that are not included in the firm data coverage. So if you look at some of these older maps, they're just very basic and they don't cover the entire stream. Um, so yeah, if you've seen those, you know what I'm talking about. They're just very primitive looking. So the BLE can help improve that and expand those areas that are not covered. So now we're looking at section B. Again, this is the firm information, so it's very straightforward. B1A is the community name. So if you have an unincorporated area of a county, then you would enter the county name and then just put unincorporated area. And that's per the instructions that accompany the elevation certificate. So the instructions have been expanded, and there's a lot more detail in them about how to complete the form. So if you're ever in question, just look at the instructions. They've really done a good job of expanding those and really explaining it, based on lessons learned, based on common mistakes and things like that. So the NFIP community identification number, that's the six-digit number um, that that is assigned to every community in Kansas. And so all of them start with 200, so 200 and then another three digits for the state of Kansas, except for Topeka, which for some reason starts with 205. I don't know why that is, but it's the only community that I've encountered that doesn't start with 200. And then for an independent city for B2 under county name, you would add independent city, which I wasn't sure what that was at first, but it's a legally separated city that has separated from the county or merged with the county that ceased to exist. So if that is ever the case, then that's what you would put. So CRS or Community Rating System communities have to have this correct. because it'll count against them if they don't. If you're not familiar with the community rating system, it's an incentive program that goes on top of the NFIP. So you do extra floodplain management stuff and you earn points, and then people can get discounts on their flood insurance. Uh, Community-wide, if you're part of that program, depending on what class you are, which means how many points you have, basically. There's different thresholds, but they have their construction documents, including elevation certificates, evaluated annually to be recertified to be in that program. So if you ever have questions about that program or you're interested in it, please let me know. But yeah, so we have the community name, community identification number, 6 digits, that's assigned to your community. You can find it easily on the Map Service Center. You can find it in the community status book or other documents. It should be readily available. The county name, and then of course the state, Kansas, and then the map and panel number for B4. They want the full number, the full community or county-wide number for your map. So we'll look at that, and then they all come with a suffix, so A, B, C, D, E, etc. That means how many times it's been republished or updated, and then we'll go through the rest. So again, full map and panel number, not the abbreviation. So if you look here, towards the bottom, the map number 2120177C0192E, that's the full map and panel number. So the E at the end, that's the suffix. So that means it's been updated that many times. And then you have your effective dates. And so towards the top or the middle, it says panel 192 of 450. That's the abbreviation. So we don't want to put that. We don't use that really. They want the full map number. So if we're looking at B4, the map and panel number, they want that full number, and then the suffix is E. And so that's where you get this. Again, you can find this on the MSC, or it should be available if you use the National Flood Hazard Layer like I showed before, with the um, ferment that you can create, or you can just look at the web map and find it. Again, find that there, use the full map number, and this is often why people want to provide it to surveyors because they might miss that and just use the abbreviation, and then that's not correct. And again, especially if you're in the CRS program, that's important. Um, After that, the community number. So that's B1B, NFIP community identification number. So you see that there where it says community in the middle, NFIP community number. So that's 200331 in this case. So again, the community number, 6 digits, starts with 200 unless you're Topeka. And then you have the community name and the county. So that is listed there on this title block of the firm. And then you have the suffix, as I mentioned, that would be E in this case, and then the effective date, September 29th, 2011. So all the information that you need is there for this section. Again, firm index date is separate from the firm panel effective. So they are often the same date, but they're not always the same date. So here's a case, and I believe this has been updated since then, but where the index dates, effective dates, and the map panel date are not the same. So the panels were 2008, and then the index ended up getting updated in 2010. And this was, I believe, a levy case where it had to be updated. So it's just an example that they might not always be the same date, so just don't assume that. And then the flood zones and the base flood elevation. Important information, the flood zone is going to be on the firm. So wherever this property, this house, most likely is located, You would find that on the firm, so you would check the property and look at the actual map panel, and then find which firm it is. So Zone A, Zone AE, occasionally Zone AO, whatever that is, you would just look at the map and make that determination. And then the base flood elevation or the depth, if it's a Zone AO, that would be calculated or measured um, based on that particular property location. And we can assist with this. I do have some more slides on this, but Keegan, my co-host, often helps people with these types of calculations. So if it's a detailed study area, meaning like a floodway or an AE zone, you'd be using the flood insurance study or the FIS or other available data for Zone A. And like I said, we have statewide data for things, so there shouldn't be a reason to use other sources. We have for the entire state this type of data, so we have that available. Um, there are, as I showed you, base flood elevations that are on the firm and like at cross sections, and in between those, they often have numbers that are rounded. We can't use those. We have to have it calculated to the nearest tenth of a foot. So that's one decimal place. We have to have it calculated. Um, as I said, we can assist with that, but your developers, your surveyors, your property owner applicants need to have it calculated. Um, and then per the instructions, if there's more than one flood zone in the area of development for B8, you would need to list those additional base flood elevations. And then, of course, if you're reviewing a permit, you don't want to assume the calculation is correct. You want to go to the map, go to the flood insurance study, and at the very least, make sure that it makes sense and that it is appropriate for that development. That's an important part of the review because I have seen low floor violations that could have been prevented and then cause a real nightmare for the property owner that then has very expensive insurance that would then have to pay to have the floor raised, which is really expensive, or they end up having to have a notice on the deed that they are out of compliance and it makes it hard to sell, or they end up on the 1316 list, which means they're ineligible for insurance, or it ends up in court. I've seen that happen as well. So it's really important to verify this during the construction process and doing those inspections, probably having the developer there to discuss it and look at that lowest floor while it's being put in just to make sure it's elevated appropriately. I've seen it go badly, and it seems like kind of a something that you could rely on a developer to ensure before they go ahead and do things, but you would be surprised at some of the things that have happened. So just a word of caution there for new development in the lowest floor. So if the base flood elevation is being used as the data source, as the best available data, then that needs to be notated in the Section D comments. And of course, that would be on the developer to do that, but you can, return an elevation certificate and ask for additional information or documentation from a developer or a property owner applicant. You don't have to accept things that they give to you as is. You can always go back and require that as the floodplain administrator. Like, I need this information before I give you the permit, or the certificate of occupation. So, if it's same as zone or location that has a letter of map change, you can look at those instructions that go with the elevation certificate. Um, Lomar for B7. So that goes for all letters of map change, Lomar F, Clomar F, Cloma, Loma, Lomar F, whatever the case is for B8. Because as I mentioned, an elevation certificate can be used in support for those types of letter of map change applications. Um, And as I mentioned, you'd look at the actual firm for the zone. So, it's totally possible in this case for a development could be in both the floodway and the AE zone. So I've kind of notated that here, the different zones, and they are labeled, and this is per the National Flood Hazard Layer, like I showed before. Um, Again, the flood insurance study, so this is the documentation that goes with your firm panels. So this is a detailed report that shows how the mapping was done. It explains the modeling and other mapping methodologies. It goes over the flood sources and the flood history. And if you have the detailed study areas, that comes complete with the flood profiles, which is basically a graphic representation of your detailed flood areas and those streams that you have for those riverine floodplains. And if you have a reservoir or a lake, something like that, as a flooding source, it'll go over those, and those elevations are completely explained in there, and they are put on still water elevation tables. So for the detailed study areas, and most of the time we're talking about riverine as far as Kansas, it'll have those BFEs in there. So this is where the developer or the applicant would get the correct BFE calculated for compliance, and especially newest or new lowest floors is critical, as I mentioned, for compliance and flood insurance and all of those things. So again, costly mistakes have been made, so it's very much worthwhile your time, the 10 minutes or so it takes to check the base flood elevation to make sure that it's correct and we're at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation because that's our minimum standard. Some communities have higher standards than that, like 2 feet of freeboard. So if you're looking for the FIS, it's under effective products, and then it has its own tab there, FIS reports, and then there it is. You can download it there, or you can even just open it up. You don't have to download it. But if you go to the flooding source, so these are the flood profiles that are basically towards the end of the report, and you find the correct flooding source, and then you can find your location based on the cross sections that are nearest to it. So the upstream and downstream cross section of your property location. Um, and again, this would be a detailed study area. So this is, in this case, an AE zone. You would go here and then ensure that the BFE is accurate and at least reasonable for this location. Again, if you have a reservoir or a lake flooding source for your property, the static base flood elevations can be obtained from either the firm or the summary of still water elevation table. And that's going to be towards the beginning of the FIS. But you should be able to find whatever your flooding source is and then verify the base flood elevation. And if you ever have questions about calculating, you can reach out to us, but also on our YouTube channel, from our training page, we have a video of Bill, who used to work with us. He went through an entire process of how to calculate a base flood elevation using the flood insurance study. So you have this instructional video as a resource as well. And then this is what the cross sections look like in the flood data table. So at the very least, you can go and look at the surrounding cross sections, and it'll have the exact base flood elevation for those cross sections to 1/10 of a foot. So in this case, we're looking at an area that's between L and M, and you can go there and make sure that the base flood elevation is at least within that range. So in this case, between 1277.4 and 1279.0. If it's outside of that range, then something is wrong if that property is between those cross sections. So they do have that. And so for an example, This is an older elevation certificate. This is a real case where the surveyor used the downstream lower base flood elevation just taken from the firm without calculating it. And so he just put 1277 on it without calculating to within 1/10 of a foot. And that's a rounded base flood elevation, not a calculated one. And of course, the higher upstream cross sections are going to have a higher number. We always want to take the most conservative number. So he used the lower downstream number, used 1277, and then the lowest floor was built at 1278.1 when the actual base flood elevation is 1279.2. So it's 1.1 feet too low below regulation for state and local. Uh, so yeah, and it federal too, really. And of course we have to have it 1 foot above. So this was a very costly mistake for that property owner, and it wasn't checked by the floodplain administrator, and it led to a lot of issues. And of course, our lives and property are at risk for flooding when we do that, so it was a bad situation all around. So again, good to be cognizant of the base flood elevation calculation and how it was done. And then B10 is to indicate the source of the base flood elevation, whether it was the flood insurance study or the firm in the case of a reservoir or lake community or whatever the source was. Sometimes we are the source as well, because again, we help people um, calculate these um, consistently. So for Zone A, which doesn't have the base flood elevation calculated, it's not in the flood insurance study. It's called an approximate floodplain. Basically, it just means, it's based on solid engineering and modeling. It just doesn't have the base flood elevation determined. So we do have this site where mostly Keegan does these calculations, but we assist people with getting that determined based on what their purpose is, new construction or informational purposes or whatever the case may be. We use our draft data, or in some cases, we have to use the effective data. But we also have LiDAR available here, so you can just go in and kind of click around on the map if you want to get an approximate LiDAR elevation of the ground surface. And so this can kind of help people decide if they want to apply for a letter of map change, um, or whatever the case may be. They just might want to explore those approximate elevations without even submitting a request. So that's accurate to within plus or minus a foot. Um, and if you need instructions, you can go under the Help tab and we have the detailed instructions there. But basically, if you're looking to submit a request, you go in and you draw a polygon as accurately as possible. And then please include the address with that request. We have a lot of back and forth with people who don't include an address, and so that's just an important part to help us save time. Include that, include as much detail as you can in your purpose and what you're trying to do, and then you'll receive a response from us within 5 days, either a letter, uh, that I'll show you an example of, or we might have to request more information. But if you can include as much in your initial requests, that will help us save time and cut down on that back and forth. And then this is the letter example that you'll get. So it'll give you the approximate lowest adjacent grade and a base flood elevation calculation, depending on, what your purpose is. So we'll use the most appropriate data for that request. And then it comes with like a little screenshot and a signature and all of that information. So it's a helpful service that we provide free of cost, of course, and this is what it looks like. Your BFE calculation and then your, approximate LiDAR and all of that. So, and then this is kind of what the homepage looks like when you click on map, and it shows you the different data that we have for these different counties and areas and watersheds. So yeah, we have that available. If you go to our website, you can also look up letters of map change. We have them mapped out. And so all of those stars, the green ones are lomas, and it'll show you all the different types. So we have even the ones that have been denied. And if you click on the star specifically, it will let you open up the actual document, the actual loma. So this has been a really helpful site for me, and I'm sure it would be for many floodplain administrators if you're aware of it. And then it's another thing to be cognizant of the datum. So our older maps are in the geodetic vertical datum 1929, which is inaccurate to say the least. It can be up to a foot of inaccuracy in Kansas. So if you have an older map, there may be conversions necessary. There's a VertCon, uh, surveyors use it to do conversions between the two datums. So most of our maps now are in the NAD 1988. That's our most current datum. So if there's conversions, that's something to be aware of with these older maps, because it can certainly cause inaccuracies if it wasn't converted or if this was overlooked or converted incorrectly. Just something to be aware of if you have an older map. Um, and then other things about this new form, um, or this most recent version of the form is that basically every single section needs to be either filled out or hit NA. So put NA doesn't apply, and yes and no on these. So if you skip B12 and 13, it'll be considered an error, technically for permitting and all of that, but also for CRS communities, these have to be checked. And of course, we're going to hit no on both of these because we're not in a coastal area. So both of these should have no clicked, but if you leave it blank, it's considered to be an error. So they need to be clicked no. So again, common mistakes in this particular section, abbreviated panel number, dates that are incorrect, because again, they might be different. Um, Flood zone blank or anything left blank really, a rounded base flood elevation, we don't want that. Or B12 and 13 left blank when they need to be hit no in Kansas. The Kansas Society of Land Surveyors, this is where you can find surveyors. So I'm not allowed to like endorse or recommend any person that is a surveyor, but we go to this association, and this is where we refer people to find a surveyor in their area. And if, again, if you're ever in doubt, just look at the instructions. They're very helpful. They're very robust. They've really gone out to explain everything and what you should do in specific situations. And FEMA bases that off of, working groups that they put together and all of the kind of learned lessons that they've had over the years with elevation certificates and mistakes and things like that. For Section E, property owners in AO zones, so these zones have a depth and not a base flood elevation, so this gets measured. Um, so the basic requirement is that the lowest floor is elevated above the highest adjacent grade at least as high as the depth number on the firm, or at least 2 feet if no depth number is specified. And a lot of communities have added on to that. It's like 2 feet if no depth is specified plus 1 foot. So they will go in and add the freeboard to that. And that's a basic requirement if you're a CRS class 8 or higher. And so the floodplain administrator should certify that compliance when there's no depth number. You go out and you measure it yourself. And then at this point, the elevation certificate specifies either natural grade or fill. They kind of have separated that out now. Um, and if it's not on natural grade, it'll explain that in the comments, so it's section F. And we are phasing AO zones out of our mapping. Again, they're kind of an older style map. We don't have a whole lot of them, and they're usually smaller areas, and we're not mapping new areas. But if you have them, this is, what to look for. Um, and so they have this on there on the form at this point. So building measurements are based on what? Drawings under construction or finished construction. And then they have added this caveat that a new elevation certificate will be required when the building is complete. So they've really taken floodplain management into consideration when they made this new form. So a reminder has been added there. So this is what it looks like. And again, you'd be measuring the lowest floor from the ground. And so people, a layman person could do this. And it's a lot like section C, but we're just measuring from the ground. So we're not taking an actual survey in this case. But again, a finished elevation certificate would be required, and then that would be done by a licensed professional. And then property owner can do this. But of course, in Kansas, we always have to have this calculated. So a zone A without BFE, it says that at the top, a zone A would have to be calculated. And then section F is just the certification. And then this is new, the section G, this is for the floodplain administrator. So it asks you to indicate what you're doing here. So G1 is if you're transcribing the information from a section C elevation certificate that was sealed by a licensed surveyor. You're just transcribing that information, but it was done by a licensed surveyor or engineer. Again, architects can't do it in Kansas. Um, 2A, if you're taking measurements for a property owner on their behalf and certifying measurements. Section H is just for insurance purposes, and that was so property owners could do it themselves without having to require a survey just to get an insurance policy. G3 is for corrections. 4 is just floodplain management purposes. Um, and this helps you to assist, it helps you with verifying permitting process and compliance. So that's why this was added, to make sure that community officials are actually reviewing these and looking at them because this section is, more or less required at this point. Um, and then, yeah, it's no longer optional. It's technically recommended, which means you have to do it. So G9A asks for the elevation of the lowest floor, and then it asks you to look at the lowest horizontal structural member, which is usually for a diagram 5, which we went over diagrams yesterday. Again, so if you weren't here, you can go see that recording. Um, and then you would put the source of that elevation in the comments. And then the BFE of the flooding at the building sites, so BFE or depth, and then it asks you to look at your community's minimum elevation requirement. So this is where the floodplain management stuff comes into play. It's asking you to look at that. So what does your community actually require for this structure? Your community freeboard requirement, which is at least 1 foot above, unless you have a higher standard. So G11 is new, and it shows you um, it's asking you if there was a variance issued and to attach that documentation if there was. And of course, variance has very specific criteria as to how they are issued. And then again, if so, put that in the comments and then attach that document. And then you just certify it. So your name, title, the community number, community name, and then your comment, sign, and date, and definitely include the email address. So this is our website. As far as the NFIP, we have this resources page. We've been doing a lot of work to update these and make sure that our pages are up to date and they're more user friendly. So definitely check that out. We have our quick guide that was updated last year. Um, Information on letters of map change. We have the how to hire a surveyor and tips on doing that, joining the NFIP, and a lot more stuff. So, oh, I went over by a minute. I apologize. Like to get into detail on these. There's a lot to go into, but I appreciate everyone being here, and I will stop sharing my screen. Um, Were there any questions, Keegan, that you saw?
No questions in the chat that I saw, but I guess if anybody needed to come off mute, I didn't see anyone type anything though.
Okay, yeah, does anyone have any questions they want to ask? Okay, well, if not, you're always free to call me or send an email if you think of something. And then, do we have some poll questions, Keegan?
Yes, let me
Or
take a
just,
look at that.
okay.
Oh geez, look like there's a bunch of them.
Yeah, basically the way the Zoom is set up that they're kind of all in there all the time. I think we just need the CFM one.
Gotcha. That one's on its way.
Okay, so this question is basically just if you're a CFM and if you'd like a certificate. If you are a CFM, I just kind of verify that you were here for at least 45 minutes to be able to get credit. Otherwise, I can still just send a certificate. I know some people just like to have it for, verifying their training and things like that. Yeah, if you want to answer that, I will get certificates out here soon. And then I'll also have a follow-up survey for everybody, um, just so that we can improve and if you have any suggestions for these classes. But other than that, I think we can wrap up here, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to train with us, and I hope to see you tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.